Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. A weak response from the federal government as China becomes more emboldened, endangering our ADF personnel yet again. At a time when there's real risks of war in our region, the Prime Minister must take this up personally with the Chinese President, not handball it to his Defence Minister. Victoria's state budget handed down today. There's red ink as far as the eye can see. Net debt tipped to hit close to $190 billion. Interest payments for Victorians, $26 million a day. Wonder how the Treasurer can justify more handouts to buy votes, but he does. Terry McCrann and the Victorian Shadow Treasurer with more. Plus an exclusive look at Josh Frydenberg's upcoming documentary with a federal minister caught out by one of Australia's most respected intelligence experts. So we'll have a look at that. And also the massive increase in pro-Muslim, pro-Palestinian votes out of Britain, candidates winning elections there over the weekend, and big warnings here for Australia. Chris Ullman with more. And a sigh of relief for anyone with a mortgage today, that cash rate on hold, but for how long? Given concerns from the RBA that inflation isn't falling fast enough, and the risk of a high-spending Canberra budget next week.
The Reserve Bank will only respond to government settings. And as the Reserve Bank Governor has pointed out, Australia has a homegrown inflation problem. We're not seeing the extent of inflation in other comparable countries that we're seeing in Australia, and that's because of the policies that have been implemented by the Albanese government.
But First Labor always claims its budgets are tough yet responsible, but in the end, they're always about handouts. And a lot of voters fall for it, even though everything government spends comes out of their pockets in the first place. Today, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers was reassuring voters that his tough and responsible budget would also involve cost of living relief, which is code for more taxpayer-funded vote buying from Labor.
A key priority, if not the key priority in the budget, will be helping to ease the pressures that we understand people are under. The defining challenge in our economy, certainly in the near term, is inflation. People are under a lot of cost of living pressure. That's why the budget will try and ease what we can of that pressure, primarily through a tax cut for every taxpayer, but with additional cost of living relief as well.
Using taxpayer funds to try and buy votes, well, that's in Labor's DNA. Today's headline spend from the Victorian state budget was a $400 cost of living handout dressed up as a school saving bonus, even though the state's net debt is still soaring, tipped to reach $187.8 billion within 4 years. Now, that's roughly around $27,000 per Victorian man, woman and child, on top of all the federal debt the Victorians owe as well. But don't worry, the debt collector won't knock on your door. What will happen, though, is that schools, hospitals, roads and public transport will all slowly deteriorate because eventually the state's credit rating gets downgraded. It already has been downgraded in Victoria. It'll go down further. Borrowing costs go up and spending finally goes down because even governments can't borrow forever. Now, what's worse, the interest bill on that debt is massive because governments, like you with your mortgage, have to pay interest on what they borrow. For Victorians, that interest bill's a massive $9.4 billion a year, or it's better explained, $26 million a day, just the interest alone, money that could be much better spent on roads, hospitals and schools. When the Kerner government was booted out back in 1992, Victoria was an economic basket case with a run on its state bank. Back then, net debt was only 16% of gross state product. Well, today it's over 25% of gross state product. In last year's state budget, there was an operating surplus forecast within just 2 years. Such Mickey Mouse numbers. I mean, that so-called surplus has been put off for at least another year. But that's Labor's style, promise tough action for tomorrow while delivering all the goodies today to get the votes you want and hope that tomorrow never comes. What does eventually come, though, is a reckoning in terms of bad roads, collapsing services and lost jobs. With handouts like today's, well, they can mask it, but they can't hide it. Showing its true ideological colours every government school student in Victoria will get access to this $400 education bonus, but they'll means test it for anyone not in a government school. And still, projects like the suburban rail loop, well, they'll go on because the government can't offend the CFMEU, whose sweetheart deals are part of its eye-watering $200 billion cost. Now, there's only one way out of this fiscal hole, and that's to cut government spending, because in Victoria, like so many other states, there's little left to sell to help clear the debt. Jeff Kennett, well, he could sell the Electricity Commission. He privatised that. Daniel Andrews, well, he even had ports to sell. Now there's almost no saleable assets left to pay down the debt, hence the runaway train for Victorians. Now, later I'll speak to the Victorian Shadow Treasurer, and he'll explain how he would deal, if elected, with the state's debt crisis, which is worse than Queensland, New South Wales and Tasmania combined. But at least state governments can cut their spending, if they've got the backbone, mostly by slimming down their bloated bureaucracies. That option's much less available to the federal government, whose big spending measures are baked in. They're things like defence, which can't be cut, or social services like the pension that has to be funded, because if you're entitled to the pension, you have to get it. The government doesn't have a choice but to fund it. A bigger problem is the bloated programs like the NDIS in Canberra that can't be cut without enormous political courage. Well, there's none of that with Labor at the moment. It makes you yearn for the days of John Howard and Peter Costello, who took the hard decisions to pay off all of Australia's national debt. Back then, it was only $96 billion, 15% of GDP, but it still took them a decade to do it. There's no chance of that happening soon. Indeed, all the signals from Canberra are yet more federal debt and deficits in the out years, on top of all the debt and deficits we've got at a state level. Imagine how much worse it'll be when Labor's green left instincts have stopped all our coal and gas exports and ended the revenue that they bring into the budget. That's when those predictions about a banana republic will feel very real. Look, the Albanese government's at pains to be polite about China, but that hasn't improved the communist dictatorship's behaviour. The latest act of bullying was on the weekend when a Chinese fighter jet dropped flares in front of an Australian naval helicopter that was enforcing sanctions near the coast of Korea. But for swift, evasive action by our pilot, there could have been a major incident. The Defence Minister, Richard Marles, called it for what it is.
This was an incident which was both unsafe and unprofessional.
Unlike the Prime Minister, who delayed announcing the Chinese Navy's sonar attack on our divers last year until after he'd had his meeting with President Xi. But this shouldn't just be a rebuke of the Chinese government at the level of Defence Minister to Defence Minister, because it's way more serious than that, and it's a repeat offence.
I think the Prime Minister needs to pick the phone up, frankly, and speak to the Chinese President, to President Xi, and express our deep concern, because at some stage there's going to be a miscalculation and an Australian Defence Force member is going to lose their life, and that is a tragic circumstance that has to be avoided at all costs.
Why has our Prime Minister gone missing here? According to the Pentagon, there's been at least 200 incidents involving aggressive Chinese forces and allied ships and planes. Unfortunately, this will get a lot worse. Under President Xi, China is set on taking Taiwan by force if necessary and becoming the world's top power. Now, we know this because that's what Xi keeps telling us. And a world under Chinese leadership would be a world much like China. Much less free, much less fair, much less democratic. And sure, China will keep taking our iron ore and all the other resource exports because they've got nowhere else to go to get them. In fact, a former US military intelligence expert has already reported they're stockpiling these materials in order to get by if trade halts as a result of an attack on Taiwan. Bad times are coming, and that's not just because Labor governments here can't manage the economy. Take Ukraine, take the Middle East. And then consider China's massive military build-up. The international outlook has never been this bleak since the late 1930s. And yet this is the federal government that doesn't seem to take these warnings seriously or give anyone the confidence they can competently manage them. All right, let's get the headlines now with Trudy McIntosh in Canberra.
Interest rates on hold for now, but the Reserve Bank Governor not ruling out hikes by the end of the year.
At the moment, we think we've got it right, but things are uncertain, and if we have to move, we will.
The Treasurer wary of the impact of the 13 rate rises in 2 years already in the system.
They are one of the reasons, but not the only reason, why our economy, and particularly consumption in our economy, has slowed considerably.
The High Court will hand down another highly anticipated detainee judgment this Friday morning. It's been examining an Iranian asylum seeker known as ASF 17 and whether he should be released despite not cooperating with efforts to deport him. If he wins, another 170 detainees in a similar position could also be freed. Last month, Labor attempted to ram through new deportation powers that it would impose jail time for detainees refusing to cooperate and ban most visas for citizens from non-cooperative countries. It was kicked off into a Senate inquiry that's released its findings today. The Coalition says it supports the intent of the new laws, but holds significant concerns about the potential for unintended consequences. It wants to see major changes to clarify who would be impacted and guardrails around the visa ban. Tensions with Beijing resurface after a Chinese jet fired flares at an Australian Navy helicopter. The near miss happened last Saturday off the coast of South Korea. The Prime Minister says Australia is using all diplomatic and defence channels to communicate our concern.
I think the Prime Minister needs to pick the phone up, frankly, and speak to the Chinese President.
We have made very strong representations at every level to China.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's get across the rest of those headlines. Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Thank you for your time, Andrew. Let's start with the Naval incident, our helicopter forced to take evasive action. This is regarding those flares. We're in international waters, of course, near North Korea. We brought this story, breaking news last night. The Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, both out today, had this to say.
This was an incident which was both unsafe and unprofessional.
We have made very strong representations at every level to China about this incident, which we regard as unprofessional and unacceptable.
He says at every level, and he uses the royal we there, Andrew. I don't understand that the Prime Minister himself has spoken to Xi. What do we know?
Well, I don't think we know anything more than what he said, but at every level it would imply at the very least Penny Wong to Wang Yi, wouldn't it? That's how I read that. I'll have to go and find out, Peter, frankly. But, yeah, it was an interesting way they announced it in terms of telling Channel 9. There wasn't any big press conference protesting about it or anything of that nature. They just dropped it out there. And then the PM was answering questions about it at the Beef Week event at Rockhampton. So they do seem a bit on the defensive in relation to this. I could be cynical, Andrew. Yes, go on.
I think dropping it to Channel 9, then disappearing to Rockhampton and getting a few 12-year-olds to ask a question at Beef Week is a lot easier than having you and others in the Canberra Press Gallery ask them some tough questions with a proper press conference.
Well, I'll show a bit more respect to the poor old young journalists who were there, Peter. But, yeah, no, look, I mean, there's no doubt that he went on the Today Show, Albanese, this morning. He got sort of hammered a bit on that. And the problem he's got is that talking tough, I'm not sure it does anything anyway. But if there's a perception that you're sort of kowtowing to Chinese authorities so they come here, etc., it's a terrible look. And that's the sort of concern. That's what Peter Dutton's honing in on. When Peter Dutton says, by the way, that one day, you know, a Defence Force member's going to die in one of these things, I think he's right, sadly. And what do we do then? We're not going to be declaring war on China, are we? So that's the biggest fear of the government. And you really worry it's going to happen.
I think we need clarity, though, from the Prime Minister. I mean, I do think it should be leader to leader. I don't think when you've had repeated instances like this that it can't be anything less than leader to leader. So I think we need clarity from the Prime Minister that he has had that call directly with President Xi. We know he's obviously in France, but he didn't get there until yesterday. So this perhaps has occurred over the weekend, but he needs to come clean on this. But we also know he had a lot of form when he was over in the United States. He flew back to Australia, and it was only when he was coming back in the air that we know about the diver incident from late last year. And it was almost, again cynically, as though he let that out of the bag when he was in the air and couldn't be asked questions about it or asked about whether he'd raised it directly with Xi.
Well, all of it relates to Justin Trudeau getting confronted by Xi at the G20 in Bali when I was there and accused of repeating private conversations. But to be honest, Anthony Albanese's happy to talk about private conversations with other leaders publicly. So why does China get a lead pass, especially when they're conducting all these aggressive acts against Australia? I mean, they put some trade sanctions on us, but I don't think they're going to do that again just because Anthony Albanese says, yes, I've spoken to Premier Li or President Xi. I don't think President Xi would take his phone call. Well, I might say that. Premier Li comes here next month, as has been foreshadowed. I'm sure he would raise it there. You know, the lowliest Chinese official wasn't taking phone calls from the previous government. So I've got no, I don't even think they try. I think they just keep it at embassy level and maybe Penny Wong level.
All right, let's go to some polling out today. This is the Resolve Political Monitor. It's pretty interesting that there's a whack of vote that's shifting away from Labor and it's men. Support for Labor from men has plunged from 37% last year to 31% this year. Support for the coalition with that same cohort's moved from 33 to 39. I mean, we've often talked about the women problem with the Liberal government, particularly Scott Morrison, of course. But this is a problem for Labor and men, and you know, prior to the last big Liberal win from opposition into government, Abbott's win in 2013, one of the early markers that we could see the vote was moving his way was that he was really picking up with men, and the men were moving across from Labor. Now, if I was sitting inside Labor now, I'd be looking at that drift away to the coalition. That's how Abbott won. That's how Howard won. That would be a concern.
And Morrison too. I mean, there's a reason Scott Morrison was spending every second day in high vis. But, yeah, that's absolutely a concern for Labor. But, you know, the women's vote is a concern for the Liberal Party. So at the moment, it looks like a bit of a draw, Peter.
Yeah, I don't think the margin drop, though, for women, I'll go back and have a look, but I don't think the margin drop for women is as great as the margin drop for Labor and men.
If you look at the overall primary, Labor still wins minority at the moment. So I could flip your question and say if Peter Dutton can do more to win the votes of women, he's in office.
Well, that'll be the challenge, won't it? A lot of arming and ahhing and still mixed signals from Labor about this Community Safety Board, who's ultimately responsible. We know the legislation says it's the Minister, but even today, the Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, well, he wasn't clear. Have a listen.
We've had the comments from Claire O'Neill, which seem to contradict the Prime Minister's view that the board was independent. Is the board independent?
Well, I'm not sure exactly why this distinction matters.
You won't give clarification on who's ultimately responsible for that decision on the bracelet?
The legislation speaks for itself.
So is that a yes or a no?
As I say, I think what we've got to focus on here is the importance of bringing expert opinion to bear on difficult questions.
I mean, this bloke's a QC or a KC they're called now. I mean, he's fudging it there. They just can't pull a trick on this, Andrew.
Well, I think the lawyers are in charge a bit. That's why they haven't brought a preventive detention order, and he is the chief lawyer, isn't he? So they're worried the High Court will say if the minister admits I'm in charge of this stuff, that's punitive, and even putting an ankle bracelet on someone is illegal. But they're still in a mess over this.
Hey, you've got some word on energy rebates. We saw they're being bolstered in Queensland, not means tested up there, and apparently the federal government's going to follow suit.
That's right. Well, again, it looks like an extension of the rebate they've already put in place. That's for lower income earners, it's for pensioners, it's for those on family tax benefit, because that's a really easy way to identify. That's people on about 156 grand a year, the whole household. Obviously, everyone else misses out. And the other interesting thing about this is there was an indication from Jim Chalmers to Treasurers a little while back that he'd want them to go 50-50 on this again. And they're reluctant to do that because of their budget situation. So maybe instead of a $500 rebate, we'll get a $250 one for those low-income earners, or maybe the feds will stump up all $500. So I think the two cost of living things in this budget, Peter, will be a lift in Commonwealth rental assistance and this extension for a year, happily past the next election in this energy bill rebate. There's not much else they can do. They'll say, oh, of course, we're doing the stage 3 tax cuts rejig as well. And they'll just tie all those together and say, other than that, we're trying to clamp down on inflation. We'll worry about growth later with these Made in Australia projects and this other money, but that'll come in the out years. That's basically the budget picture that we're going to see next Tuesday. I don't think it's going to be the world's most exciting budget, Peter.
Yes, well, we'll see, won't we? Thank you very much, Andrew Clennell. All right, earlier today, Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas handed down the state's budget in Victoria. Simon Love has been in the Victorian Parliament. Here is the latest.
Good evening, Peter. Well, Tim Pallas's 10th budget here in Victoria certainly came across as a Conservative budget for a Labor government, but the debt is certainly the headline figure. The largest debt of any state in the nation, currently forecast by the fiscal year 2028 to reach $187.8 billion. And already we've heard from ratings agencies such as Moody's, who say that they don't have any confidence that Victoria will be able to stabilise that debt until 2028, while S&P, who currently have the state of Victoria on a AA credit rating, says that it would take a mammoth effort to turn around the state's finances. Of course, the credit rating is crucial when it comes to the interest payments, which have continued to rise, and they're concerned that interest payments could become 10% of the economy, and that would have a drag on a number of other factors, including spending. Now, as for spending, well, the government did unveil a $400 bonus for all state school students. That's designed to be spent as a cost of living measure on camps and excursions. Tim Pallas says this won't be his last budget, but when I asked him today, Peter, how long it may take my grandkids, if I'm lucky enough to have any, or at least the next generations to pay off that debt, Tim Pallas wouldn't give a straight answer. So that's certainly going to be the key thing that burdens the government over the next 2 years ahead of the next state election in 2026.
Thank you there, Simon Love. Let's bring in Victorian Shadow Treasurer Brad Rowswell. Brad, thank you for your time. I made the point at the top of the show, red ink as far as the eye can see. There's not much left to sell for Victorians in order to turn this budget debt deficit around. And of course, in real terms, you're paying $26 million a day just to service the interest payments on that debt, meaning that's not money for hospitals, it's not money for schools, it's not money for roads. What are your big takeouts from today?
Always great to chat, Peter. Look, firstly, this is what Victorians get after 10 years of Labor. This is what the price of Victorians pay after a decade of the Labor government here in Victoria, after a decade of Labor budgets. At the same time as their tax take has increased significantly, so has their debt, and so has their spending, and so has their waste. In the last 10 years alone, there's been more than $40 billion wasted on major project cost overruns, major project blowouts. And that means that we haven't got the money that we need to do the things that matter. And at the moment in Victoria, we've got a crime crisis on our hands. We've got educational standards that are flatlining. Could you imagine, Peter, what we could actually do in Victoria if the economy had been managed in not a reckless way, but in a responsible way, and the fact that Victoria would be ahead again, as it once was a decade or more ago?
Victoria used to be like the other states, Queensland and WA, a resource state. It used to export coal, it used to export gas. It doesn't even use that now for Victorians, Brad. And it's also taking in a lot of migrants from overseas. The Victorian population, 6.7 million and rising. Pressure on housing, businesses leaving the state. They can't afford to do business in Victoria. Homeowners selling up and getting out as well. I mean, how on earth do you turn the state around? I mean, what does Victoria generate to pay off this this debt?
Well, the first thing we've got to do, Peter, is start rolling out the red carpet and less red tape for businesses. Last year there were some 5,000 plus businesses that closed in this state. At the same time, 7,000 businesses that closed in this state at the same time as businesses grew by about 3,000 in New South Wales and 5,000 in Queensland, on the back of the opportunity they have with the Olympics there. So the first thing we've got to do is say to businesses that have recently left Victoria or shut in Victoria, and the thing we need to say to businesses in Victoria who are just, falling over under the pressure of Labor taxes is, Victoria will again be open for business under a Liberal national government here after the 2026 election. We've got to grow the economy. We've got to, stimulate the economy by getting off people's backs, by getting off businesses' backs. You mentioned housing, Peter. It's no wonder that we're in the middle of a housing crisis here in Victoria, that, rentals are unavailable and unaffordable. In the 53 new or increased taxes in the last 10 years under Labor, around half of those have been property taxes. Now, this is coming from a Labor government who say they care, but they frankly just don't. You don't tax something more and make it cheaper. If you tax something more, it's going to get more expensive and someone's got to pay for that. And the people that are paying are often vulnerable Victorians. Labor in this state after the last 10 years really don't give a stuff, and they're now paying the price for 10 years of Labor budgets.
Brad Rowswell, thank you for your time. I think if you get the job, I'm afraid it's a bit of a hospital pass, but all the best. After the break, interest rates are on hold for now, but how long as Labor looks set to spend up big and risk spiking inflation in next week's federal budget? Plus, a little later on, we'll take another look at Josh Frydenberg's documentary, but I'll give you something exclusive. This is about the inflammatory phrase "from the river to the sea," and it's a question he put directly to the Prime Minister. Welcome back. Still to come, more on that near miss with China and why the PM needs to show some spine and call this out, with the Foreign Minister now responding. This is from China. I've got those comments for you in just a moment. But first, the RBA has left the cash rate on hold once again, 4.35%. Good news if you've got a mortgage, but as we know, inflation remains too high. The RBA says it will not rule out further increases. The Governor, Michelle Bullock, has revealed inflation is declining slower than expected.
Inflation at the moment is still declining, but it's declining less quickly than we thought it would. So at the moment, we still think that we can make our target of coming back into target range by 2025.
Joining me now to get across this and more, business columnist at the Herald Sun, Terry McCrann. Well, great to have your company. It's been a busy day today with the RBA and the Victorian state budget. I mean, national security concerns to one side. I think the biggest issue facing Australia is dogged inflation. And the risk is obviously next week with the budget. Treasurer won't be able to help himself. He'll throw some money around. That could cause another spike. What did you make of the Reserve Bank Governor's comment today?
Well, I think you might have picked up in that comment, Peter, that Michelle Bullock is hoping that we can sort of get through this without a dramatic further increase in rates or the sort of economy hitting the wall where they're going to have to belatedly slash rates. And having to make that choice, she's fundamentally got to get on top of inflation. And I'm encouraged that she appreciates that. She realises that's her first task. She's not going to be helped by the budget next week, but I don't think she's going to be badly hindered by the budget.
Oh, good.
It's all the negatives. No, but that's only half the story, Peter, as you know. All the negatives coming out of Canberra are those other things. The craziness of what Bowen is doing with energy and what Tony Burke is doing with industrial relations and potentially pumping up wages. The one thing that we cannot have is any sort of wages explosion. You could kiss goodbye to success on inflation, and inevitably you'll be seeing not rates staying where they are for an extended period, but going up.
What did you make of the Treasurer last week trying to downplay how risky inflation is to the climate?
Well, I can understand that he doesn't want to be blamed for the dynamics that are unfolding, but yes, it was not a good look, because, as you say, Peter, the fundamentally important foundation for a successful economy is low inflation. We had it for 20 years in the Howard years and earlier, but that's the big risk. So the Treasurer should be putting his weight behind Michelle Bullock rhetorically as well as in terms of policy.
What about the push from the unions? You talked there about wages. Obviously, we've got Fair Work weighing in on decisions, but you know, out of Queensland, we had this decision. 10 days, in addition to sick leave and annual leave, 10 days of reproductive leave, prostate cancer screening, menstrual leave, you know, your period's a bit painful, take some time off work, IVF, all of that wrapped up. That's now law in Queensland for public servants. They want to make this a national reproductive leave 10-day period. On top of everything else businesses got to wear, enough's enough, really. Haven't we got sick leave when we're sick?
Well, that's it exactly, Peter, that I should tread softly in the space. I mean, obviously...
Yes, you're a bloke. I know it's treacherous, but...
But anything that adds to business cost or business inflexibility and makes it hard for business to survive, not simply survive, not make a profit, just simply survive, is ultimately bad news for the workers, women and men. So we should not be trying to reimpose all the rigidities we had previously in the industrial relations system, and also the costs. We need business to be successful. That's what creates jobs.
Yeah, I guess if you put the reproductive leave with the domestic violence leave, with the sick leave, it's bigger than a lot of people have for annual leave. There was a report out today from the ANU saying that the gender of board directors doesn't have a flow through to its financial performance. So the line's often been, you know, you put more women on the board, it's going to be run better governance, perform better, and you'll see it at the bottom line, but that's not the case.
Well, exactly. I mean, what's missing from that analysis is what negatives do any board deliver, whether it's male, female, whatever mix, to the success of a company, as opposed to the owner-proprietor in small business, because boards themselves are so driven by agendas and being politically correct. In the main, they become a burden on company performance and business performance rather than an aid. But the bottom line is the directors that should be appointed should be the best people for the job, male, female, whatever, and in whatever proportion that business requires and what makes sense for that business.
What about this Psi Quantum funding last week? $1 billion, secret process. The company had very little revenue last year. It only registered basically when this expressions of interest went out. And there's a lot of concern that no Australian computer company got a look in.
Well, exactly, Peter. I mean, bottom line, you do not want the politicians trying to pick winners, thinking they can pick winners for whatever reason. And some of those reasons are not exactly kosher. I mean, picking winners because it suits agendas, picking winners because you want to favour somebody, whether it's an international company or a local company.
Or Labor lobbyists.
Or Labor mates, basically, that's in this case. So, no, it's a bad look. And we've got to pay for it. $1 billion is going to come from out of our pockets, and there's no prospect that it'll actually succeed in what it's doing. And what will it do for Australian jobs and Australian development and Australian industry?
Just quickly, Victoria, is it an economic basket case after today?
It's not looking good, Peter, and the hidden costs are going to come really rushing down the pike when all those people have to be housed, have to be provided with services, more police, more hospitals, more nurses, etc. None of those costs are reflected in the numbers, and we've already got that massive debt.
Shocking. Terry McCran, thank you. All right, after the break, Chris Uhlmann with more. We're going to get into the issues out of the UK, their council elections, particularly this Muslim vote push and why we have to ensure it can't happen here. Plus, the latest incident with China. We'll look at that. As I said, Chris Uhlmann up next.
Right now at Carpet Call, you can order our plantation shutters from just $275 per square metre. But hurry, this special offer won't last. So, to transform the look of your home, you know who to call.
The experts in the trade.
Explore the rivers of Europe with Viking. Unpack once and enjoy everything that's included.
Enjoy 15 days in Europe from just $6,395 per person. Book by 31 May at Viking.com or see your Viking travel agent.
Doesn't get any better than this.
Extra gooey caramel, coated with luscious Tim Tam chocolate. Discover our most indulgent Tim Tam range ever. What more could you wish for?
Hey, it's Tucker Carlson. I'm so excited to come to Australia to be part of the Australian Freedom Conferences. And we're going to be talking about what is happening in your country and ours.
Log into Ticketek now. Race car drivers change lanes very fast, but with no outside mirrors, how come they don't crash? Introducing Angel View, the wide view mirror attachment that helps reduce blind spots. Angel View simply snaps over your car's rear view mirror, giving you a 160-degree view behind you. Just look at the difference. Now you can see through those rear side windows too. See your blind spots. Ordinary rear view mirrors are small and flat, but Angel View has a huge mirror with curved glass. This convex shape can help you see blind spots with one glance. Watch again. Here's what you see with that ordinary rear view mirror, and here's what you see with Angel View. You think you're clear to change lanes, but you're not. And that's why they call it a blind spot. But Angel View's crystal clear mirror gives you amazing panoramic vision without that awful fisheye effect like other little mirrors. And with our special coating, it's anti-glare at night. Angel View installs in seconds to virtually any car or SUV. And the spring-loaded rubber feet automatically adjust to hold on tight. From a senior driver to younger motorists and everyone in between. Get a wide view with Angel View. Call Global Shop Direct or go online now and get Angel View for the low price on your screen. This wide view mirror attachment gives you a 160-degree view behind you and helps you see blind spots from your car's rear view mirror. But wait, order right now and we'll double the offer. That's right, buy one, get one more. That's one for you and a family member too. Angel View is quick and easy to attach and fits over most rear view mirrors. But if you're not completely satisfied, just send it back within 30 days for a full refund of the product price. You'll see the difference when you drive with Angel View. So don't miss this fantastic buy one, get one more offer. Call or go online to order Angel View from Global Shop Direct today.
Great idea!
Global Shop Direct!
Welcome back. Still to come, the battle for Rafah in Gaza has begun. I'll get you all those details. And a comment from the Chinese ministry about that incident involving a naval helicopter. Extraordinary stuff. What they have said is extraordinary. Well, let's go to something I discussed last night with regards to the UK local council elections over the weekend and how for the first time ever, at least on this sort of scale, sectarian voting has occurred. So not just the basic functions of councils, who you want to see in the job, but sectarianism, a religious element to the feature of motivation for so many voters. You need to look at a fact that a Greens candidate was nominated primarily on an anti-Israel platform and chanting this.
We will not be silent. We will raise the voice of Gaza. We will raise the voice of Palestine. Allahu Akbar!
Joining me now, as he does every Tuesday, Chris Uhlmann. Chris, we discussed last week all these fractures emerging in our electorate. I made the point that we often trace it back to stuff that happens, particularly in the UK, that migrates its way here. How concerned are you about what we saw in these council elections?
Well, Peter, the first thing to note is it's a council election. That guy should be interested in emptying the bins and filling up potholes, not what's happening in Gaza. But certainly that's what we saw there. And I think the first call of citizenship should be to the country that you're in. And I think that both for the UK and Australia, that's an issue now, isn't it? What is the first duty of a citizen? Well, it should be to the country that they're in. The other thing is that you should hopefully leave hatreds, old hatreds behind you. And that doesn't mean, of course, that people shouldn't express their passions and their political positions or petition the government over the things that they'd like to see changed. But you would hope that the first call of anyone in citizenship is to the country that they're in. And unfortunately, I think now that's too diffuse an idea that we don't actually ask enough of being an Australian citizen, for example.
Keir Starmer, as you know, is in the box seat at the general election, so he's likely to be Prime Minister. But Labor's losing its vote to these pro-Palestinian Green types. George Galloway, of course, has come back. There's also a push from a considerable large Muslim vote bloc. They've met with Starmer. They want 18 of their demands picked up as part of Labor's platform, including they want military ties cut with Israel. They want to allow followers of Islam in schools to be able to pray. I mean, there was a recent High Court decision that went against this. They even want a percentage of public sector pensions to be invested in so-called ethical and Islamic funds. Now, why this is relevant to us here, in Australia, we're now seeing this sort of religious-based pressure groups turn up. One's called the Muslim Vote. The other one's called Muslim Votes Matter. They rank MPs based on their support for Palestine. These groups are also very strongly embedded in the UK. They haven't been a feature of our politics, but they are now.
Yeah, that's something that all multicultural societies are going to have to deal with, isn't it, Peter? It was always going to be the long-run question of multiculturalism, is that how do you develop some kind of national unity, some kind of national identity? And I think that that's where we've been lacking in all of this, is to try and say that, well, if you become an Australian citizen, there are certain things that are required of you. And among all of them, first among all of them, has got to be an agreement that we believe in a parliamentary democracy. The rule of secular law is a strong part of what should be to be an Australian citizen. So I think that we need to stop talking about the things that divide us and start talking more about the things that unite us. And we have to develop an idea of Australia where people can be proud of Australia to fight back against some of these ideas. We need to put up a better proposition than the one that they've got on offer and defend it.
Yeah, it's hard to defend, though, when our politicians go to water. I mean, we've run this from the weekend. I'll play it again. I mean, Jason Clare out there saying, that chant from the river to the sea meant different things to different people. Well, I mean, that's as weak as water. Josh Frydenberg, well, he picked up this particular issue in his upcoming Sky documentary. Here's a little of what he's uncovered. Have a listen.
The genocide to the sea, which calls for the effective destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. Do you see that as a statement inciting violence?
It's a very violent statement. There are sections of the Australian community who do see people of the Jewish faith, wherever they are around the world, as part of Israel. Therefore, statements of violence against Israel can very easily flow over into actions of violence against communities in our own country.
On the issue of the river to the sea, Dennis Richardson again described it as an extremely violent statement.
It is.
And so it has no place on our streets.
I agree.
OK, we hear the PM say that. He certainly rebuked his minister, Jason Clare, yesterday, but he's only rebuking him now. He hasn't been rebuking him or anyone else about that statement since October, since it all started to come to a head. And I think, you know, the political strategist in me looks at what Clare's doing. His seat's got 30% Muslim vote. Perhaps he's given some licence here, Chris, to throw some sort of grey around that statement and allow it to be said. I mean, you can't get a better authority than Dennis Richardson, former ASIO boss, who says it's a violent statement. I mean, Clare's not ignorant. He knows exactly what he's saying.
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think the Prime Minister sees the political gravity around him falling in the direction of Palestine. And think about it. The closest numbers that matter to the Prime Minister are the Labor caucus. Now, I think it's a fairly strong bet that the majority of the left in Labor's caucus certainly support Palestine. We know the New South Wales right supports Palestine. The Queensland right supports Palestine. So the numbers underneath the Prime Minister, supporting the Prime Minister on what he should do on Israel, would be falling away from him. And then, of course, they look at the electorates in Western Sydney where there's that large Muslim majority in some places. And, of course, they are in hand-to-hand combat with the Greens in the inner city for that vote on the pro-Palestinian question. And I'll put this to you, Peter, because this is a really serious question. On Friday, the UN is scheduled to vote on admitting Palestine as a full member state. How will the Labor Party vote? That is an active question inside the government at the moment. Don't forget, it was Australia that voted first for the partition of Palestine, for the creation of the State of Israel, and it was Doc Evatt that led the charge on that. It was the Labor Party. So if things change, it will be a significant change come Friday.
Well, we'll see if those comments from Penny Wong a little earlier in the month were about sort of putting some burley in the water to see what would happen. Don't forget, of course, people at home, you can watch Josh Frydenberg's documentary, Never Again, The Fight Against Anti-Semitism, on Tuesday, the 28th, so after the budget week at 7 o'clock. Let's go to that Chinese incident. You're a bit of a sinophile here, an expert for us, Chris Yorman. We've just got into the newsroom some comments from China's foreign ministry. They've spoken about the incident. In fact, they've blamed Australia. Have a listen.
What truly happened was an Australian military aircraft deliberately flew within close range of China's airspace in a provocative move that endangers China's maritime and air security. The situation was handled was consistent with our law and regulations, professional and safe. China has lodged serious protests to the Australian side on its risky moves. We urge Australia to immediately stop the provocations and hypes to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation.
So we were provocative and we were clearly not in international space. We were in their zone. How credible is that?
Oh, well, it's as credible as what we usually hear out of that ministry, but at least it's strong. I don't think that what we've heard out of the Australian government is strong at all. What have they said? That it's unprofessional? No, it's an act of hostility committed in international waters, which endangered yet again the lives of our servicemen and women. And it's not good enough that we simply say that this is an unprofessional action. And I heard you talk about this earlier, Peter, and you're a little bit incredulous about the way this unfolded. Let me tell you, Andrew Probyn got that story. He didn't get it from Richard Marles. He contacted Richard Marles. So Channel 9 journalists contacted Richard Marles and asked for a comment. I wonder, given that this happened on Saturday, whether the government was intending to comment at all until it was fronted by a journalist.
And what about the Prime Minister then scooting off to Beef Week, not handling a press conference with the Canberra Gallery on something as significant and repeated as this?
Yes, Peter, and we spoke just a little while ago too about something else that's happening inside Australia's borders, and that is that China is pre-positioning virtual bombs on our critical infrastructure. Now, Li Cheng arrives in Australia in June. I would have thought that a government that says that we'll cooperate where we will and disagree where we must be getting a fairly long list now of points of disagreement that are reasonably serious before we can start talking about what kind of cooperation that we can have with China, because this isn't the action and these aren't the actions of a friendly nation. These are the actions of a hostile nation. And I can't for the life of me see what we've really won in the new settlement with China beyond that they've bought our silence for most of the time.
And a bit of wine and a few lobsters, but we've got ourselves in a lot of trouble here, Chris Yorman. Thank you as always. See you next week. All right, after the break, Israel Defence Forces are on the ground in Rafah. What does this mean? How does it play out? What about the hostages too? Plus, Rishi Sunak says they're heading for a hung parliament. We'll give you the latest out of the Trump trial and the upcoming VP selection for President Trump. Welcome back. Let's get into things international. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. I want to start with all this talk today, and we certainly saw it in the headlines. Hamas agrees to ceasefire. We learned this afternoon that the IDF, this is the Israeli forces, have taken control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing. Now, this ceasefire deal was mediated by Qatar and Egypt. We're told that the Israelis will not sign up. They say it's far from Israel's basic requirements. Michael Danby, you've got some insights here about stuff that just isn't reported out there in the mainstream media. Why aren't Israel at this stage agreeing to ceasefire?
Well, Al Jazeera just issued the terms of the Hamas ceasefire. It changes a fundamental issue of 33 living hostages were to be released to 33 living or dead. Now,
and that's why the Israelis won't sign up.
That's why the Israelis won't sign up. Then Hamas killed 4 Israeli soldiers at the place where humanitarian aid is being transferred, Kerem Shalom, and now they've gone into Rafah. So they've seized a small southeastern corner. They've issued maps for people to transfer to the beach and to Khan Yunis, and they're really responding to Hamas in the way that dishonest, crooked release by Al Jazeera highlights.
Living hostages and then to living in debt. And every time I hear the word of the hostages, I hate to think what they have gone through. And I wonder how many are even still alive.
Well, it's exactly that. That may be not 33 alive, but you don't make agreements with the Secretary of State of the United States, the Egyptian government, Qatar, Israel, and then abrogate it unilaterally, and then have the BBC and the world media hail it as a great achievement.
I guess the problem here is everyone's reading the headlines today, and I certainly did, seeing that the Hamas has given in to the ceasefire demands. I think that's at least a start, whereas Israel on this, but
it's true. We live in
a story.
Snackable content in this digital era. It's this headline-based information economy. People read headlines. There's no incentive to click further down and dissect an issue. And when Israel is already swimming upstream in the PR battle in many ways, this certainly doesn't help.
Hey, Trump warning today about, breaching court orders and all sorts of things, and threats about sending him to jail. What's happening?
So this is the gag order in the New York criminal case, the hush money trial case. Most people continue, including Trump haters, which there are many, continue to see this as nakedly political. Something like 70% of Republicans and 22% of independents see it that way, because the origins of the case, the novel legal theory that stitched together these different statutes to bring this charge that other prosecutors, including the New York State, failed to or declined prosecuting
including
before.
The Department of Justice.
And the Department of Justice and the Federal Election Committee, that's kind of the crux of the legal theory. Then you have this motley crew of witnesses and unreliable narrators, a porn star, his convicted perjurer fixer, like you can't make this stuff up. And then on top of that, you layer on a gag order, which many say is completely unconstitutional, because if there's one person in the country that should be allowed to speak freely, it is a criminal defendant, when the entire weight of the system is against him.
Yes.
And then you layer on top of that he's actually a former president and the current front runner trying to campaign. So it gets a lot of people very angry. But I think the high stakes maneuver here is it's political. It's using the tools to somehow contain him. And if he is to be convicted, which people expect he will be, does that muddy him up enough that some swath of the electorate who doesn't pay attention to these details, this will find him untouchable and won't vote for him?
We haven't got much time. VP frontrunners for Trump, what can you tell us?
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who chaired that memorable session where she got the university presidents on the run.
Yes.
Really good exposure, really good questions. J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, who's become the sort of leader of the isolationist wing.
Yes.
And Governor of North Dakota, Doug
Burgum.
Yeah. And finally, great addition, African-American Senator Tim Scott. Now, he's a really articulate. The only trouble with him is he's too nice a guy to be in politics.
We don't mind a nice guy every once in a while. You're a nice guy, Michael Daniel.
Oh, well.
I'll leave it there. Thank you both. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.